Before jumping in, this video is available ad-free in an audio podcast form on locals.com. It's a Patreon alternative that is much better, and my entire content library is available on Odyssey, which is a YouTube platform alternative for those who want a different place to check things out. And there's also a link down below to Acre Gold, because having some precious metals is always a good idea. I have some too, and they have a great service for setting you up with affordable grams of gold in case the world falls apart. Now though, Watchdogs Legion. The summary of my thoughts is fairly simple here. I was bored while playing this game. The video is not a full review, far from it. I won't actually be able to do that kind of in-depth, comprehensive review until later next week, but as an impressions video, there is already more than enough to say. And I felt like I wanted to dive into why I view this game to be mediocre at best, which is disappointing because conceptually it seemed like it had some serious potential. The basic premise of a decentralized protagonist was very intriguing, at least initially. The concept of having any NPC in the world become playable, with their own story, gadgets, and loadout was something that immediately roped me in. But in practice, something feels missing. Generally speaking, the game seems, as a first impression after a number of hours playing and a decent chunk of main story points having been hit, to follow a hacking/collective activist group called DedSec. DedSec is fighting back against an authoritarian surveillance state in post-Brexit UK, and that's where my first main point comes into play. The game is not as political as I had thought at first, but this is from Ubisoft, the company who repeatedly claimed for years that they avoid politics in their games. That's a lie. That's a stone-cold lie. Not only is the game political by design, it also tackles things like, within the first couple hours, mind you, it also tackles things like immigration policy, detention camp squalor, populism, fascism, and a whole bunch more I just probably haven't even seen yet. That's okay, it's perfectly fine to intentionally construct a game in that way, but from Ubisoft, the now famous we avoid politics monolith in the industry, it's just out of place. However, that's really just a thematic discrepancy between public relations optics and the game's overarching theme. The real stuff that detracted from my playthrough is much more severe and far more important. There is a phenomenon/practice called willing suspension of disbelief. The idea is you forego critical thinking to maintain plausibility in a fictional scenario, effectively allowing yourself to believe it for the sake of enjoyment. This was sadly not possible for me. Normally I would be able to do this with a game, but for some reason in Watchdogs Legion, I've been so far unable to do so. For starters, from a mechanical perspective, the lip sync and facial animations coupled with the voice acting are pretty subpar. It's actually kind of hilarious how janky some of the cutscenes are, and that really is the tip of the iceberg. But it already yanks you out of the mood, even as the game tries desperately to be impactful and profound. Side note, one of the reasons I've heard for this, and one of the explanations, and I have no idea if it's true, so grain of salt here, is that they only had a couple hundred voice actors, but there are like 10,000 NPCs, so they just modulated the voice for all of them, and that led to a weird kind of disconnect between the facial animations and how you perceive their voice, and I don't really know, but I've heard that they just modulated things with pitch, etc., and it really messed with your immersion. Speaking of trying desperately to be profound, the whole thing is kind of like a how you doing fellow kids meme. These might seem small individually, but combined, they were effectively destroying my ability to exist in a suspended state of disbelief. For example, characters are swearing all the time. It's almost absurd, actually. These characters, almost all of them, curse even more than I do in a live stream. That's saying something, that really is. It's like every meaningful reveal in almost every important sentence in the entire game has multiple F-bombs in it, and that wouldn't normally distract by itself, but it feels so unbelievably forced and shallow that the end result is to contribute to your inability to really take the game seriously. A game that is about some of the most serious topics in our contemporary political world right now. Here's another example. The game repeatedly refers to the dark web, even saying at one point, I think, I'll paraphrase here, all the cool kids are starting hacker collectives on the dark web now, but for anyone who has even a rudimentary understanding of what the deep web is, or the dark net, this is just idiotic. First, there is the general internet and the surface web. That's where almost everyone typically operates. And then there are deeper levels, such as pages that can't be accessed or indexed via search engine. I'm not an expert, not at all, just keep that in mind, but knowing that the dark web isn't even a real thing, as well as knowing that the deep web is mostly just broken links, spam, dead ends, and the like, generally speaking, it's a bunch of crap you can't access with Google, while the dark net is a specialized section of the deep web which requires extra steps to access. Once you even understand the tiniest bit about these things, suggesting that the cool thing to do nowadays is start up a hacking collective on the dark web, it's idiotic, and yet again subtracts from one's ability to suspend their disbelief and look at this game as some sort of profoundly meaningful techno-hacker thriller. Sadly, the game is riddled with this kind of thing. How about the fact that there are strong implications that DedSec does not kill civilians unless it's a massive last resort? They even have a series of non-lethal weapons as the standard armaments for most characters, but when you do find someone with a lethal weapon, you can just go on a rampage and kill everyone you want, and there are no actual consequences. The game can't decide what it wants to be. The lore makes it seem like it should follow the Assassin's Creed framework of sorts, where harming innocent people will cause you to fail in your mission. After all, DedSec is supposed to be for the people, liberating them from a fascist regime. But unlike Assassin's Creed, it has no actual punishments for carving through the population. Essentially, it's a game that says, we don't harm civilians. Here are a ton of non-lethal pieces of gear, and we will make sure you know that that's the case, but also go play it like GTA 5 if you want, because we have no thematic consistency whatsoever. I also ran into some really shallow aspects that disrupted my pacing and made the game significantly less enjoyable from a technical perspective. One, there is no hipfire. You can only aim down sights to shoot, which would probably be fine, honestly, if there weren't so often times where you're behind cover and blind firing around the corner would be extremely helpful. After all, this is a pseudo cover-based shooter. It really is. Or another example, when you're in close quarters engagements around cars or something like that, and you can't actually just hipfire quickly. You have to fully aim down sights. It's not a huge deal, but it is rather annoying. On top of this, the melee combat cycle is kind of a joke. The movesets differ seemingly from character to character and will undoubtedly repeat after a certain number, to be sure, but as you enter combat encounters as any one character and participate in the melee system, you will see that when you dodge attack, every single time it does the same move. Often some kind of ridiculous flourish kick or the like, and it's just comical how your character will repeatedly, over and over, do some pirouette spin in order to execute a hilariously impractical kick every single time you dodge. Repetition itself is not intrinsically bad, but when that repetition is actually boring, it can be. A lot of the missions, at least early on, revolve around reconstructing echoes. I don't remember what they are actually called in this particular game because in the Division franchise, they are echoes. Like, practically everything else in this game was ripped from other titles. They're identical, by the way, echoes and whatever it is in this game. It's the same exact mechanic. I mean, you literally do the Assassin's Creed leap of faith at one point. Sure, it's probably an Easter egg, I guess, and just a nod to their other properties, but I don't know, when so much of the game is so similar to Ubisoft's tried and true existing game library, it becomes very noticeable. The game feels disjointed so far, and I don't think I would actually say something like that in a first impressions video typically, because the systems it relies on, the puzzles, the environmentally influential hacking that you can do, etc., the systems are actually pretty good. But the disjointed nature of this narrative and the decentralized protagonist themes seem to just become increasingly frayed around the edges the longer I play. Mechanically, it's fairly obvious what's going on here. Since you are able to recruit almost any NPC in the entire world to your cause, and each of those recruitments has a mission that must be completed to secure the operative, there's a pool of missions it will draw from with each new contact. I don't know how many missions are in that pool, but if it's a very large number, the game will have far more depth and be very commendable. If it's a medium to small number, the game is going to fall apart real fast. Because you are always switching between characters, you really don't end up identifying with very many of them. I have 2 or 3 that I like right now, I guess, but even if I find one I really like, the game forcefully pulls you out of them and puts you into another one, periodically, that you may hate pretty much all the time. It's cool in theory, decentralized, control anyone, everyone is your puppet, etc., but it's actually pretty bad in practice, at least from the perspective of narrative impact and character attachment. The open world gives me some mixed feelings. On the one hand, it seems like there's a lot to do for like 3 hours, then it falls apart and becomes clear the repetition is going to be insane. Also, for a game that centers on liberating the world from fascist governments, I have yet to see a single indication that anything like that has happened or is happening. Granted, I haven't done a whole lot in the game yet, and granted there are a number of other boroughs on the map, but even when doing 6+ hours of liberation through the main storyline, there is literally no change in the entire open world to reflect your rebellious efforts. That's strange, because Ubisoft is entirely capable, and have done so in the past, of producing this kind of dynamic world change in other titles. It exists elsewhere, it does, but not here, in what is arguably a world where it should be even more important to see those changes. Gameplay choice, though, to be fair, is not lacking. As you infiltrate a compound, you can easily go through guns blazing, or do the whole thing with stealth puzzles and disguises, sometimes. The ability to really choose how you tackle some of these buildings adds to the experience in a way that is desperately needed, and it's also very good to see and appreciated. Some of the best parts in the entire game so far for me are when you take control of drones and spider bots, which seems cool till you realize that it's an open world immersive sim Watchdogs game with shooting elements and so much more. And the most fun is when you're on a railway platforming sequence for 5 minutes with a little robot. Once I realized that, I couldn't really unring that bell. This game is not bad. It's not a game that is undeserving of your playtime entirely if you enjoyed the previous Watch Dogs entries, but it's also a game that does not live up to what I had hoped for due to a myriad of smaller issues that wreck my ability to exist in a suspended state of disbelief. It might get better, the story might improve, it's entirely plausible, but the trajectory seems to be on a decline, a steep decline. However, I wouldn't say the game should be raked over the coals completely, especially because these are impressions, not a full review. Who knows, my entire list of complaints may evaporate entirely, but I sincerely doubt that will be the case. I'm not really enjoying my time in Watchdogs Legion. Some of you might, and the theme had its hooks in me pretty early on. For some people that could persist, but I found myself to be, more often than not, bored. That's the sad truth. I'm just bored by this game. And worse yet, annoyed by some of the ways they choose to explain or discuss things. Final example. At one point, a character says something like, they created a new hacking group, the world's first peer-to-peer hacking collective, but isn't a hacking collective peer-to-peer by definition? Is that not an immutable truth? It's like the game wants to be cool so desperately that it comes across like a 60-year-old man on an iPod shuffle saying, so you like the Coldplay there, kids? I really wasn't enjoying myself. Overall, the game isn't bad per se, and maybe it improves with time, but my first impressions are that it's mediocre, and I can't imagine it being anything other than a bargain bin purchase in the end, but who knows. That's it. If you want to support, links down below. Buy yourself some gold, so when the surveillance state takes over, you can still barter with the underground trade network that emerges. And also check out Locals, Odyssey, merch, and another gaming YouTuber as well, all of which is linked down below, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.